time next week. Let me shut my door. That way, if I curse, nobody will hear me, right?
I will.
All right. Can everybody see the screen?
Yes.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. And by the way, you guys certainly can ask questions throughout the whole class. I've got an appointment right after 4, so we're not going to go beyond 4, even if we're not done. Okay, so although this first form is not the purchase agreement, everybody knows today that you need to have the entry coronavirus entry form signed by you yourself and your 2 clients. There's 3 people allowed in a house at one time. If you're going to have more than 3 people, you may have to do it half of your group at a time, and then you may need 2 peds for that particular listing. Everybody understand that? Okay. You should read it like everything we're going over today. You should read it and understand the form. Okay, so that's the form. I expect you to read it and understand it. When writing a purchase agreement for your client, first of all, today it's so competitive, you could take some notes or write some notes. Every buyer of yours should be pre-qualified or pre-approved by a trusted lender, a lender that you know, that you've spoken with, that you can rely on. They're not just going to give you a pre-qualification letter signed that doesn't have any meat and potatoes behind it. So having said that, I'm going to assume you know your buyer, you've got all their contact information, you've put them in touch with your lender, or you've been in close touch with their lender and you've asked the question you needed to see their FICO scores, their proof of funds, which you're going to need that to present an offer anyway, and their income. So the first thing when you sit down with your buyer, excuse me, this is real touchy. When you sit down with your buyer, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to have them sign your agency disclosure or disclosure of agency relationship. California has 3 agencies. There's a buyer's agent, someone that represents the buyer exclusively, a seller's agent represents the seller exclusively, and then a dual agent or an agent that represents both the buyer and the seller. So if you are representing both the buyer and the seller, you're a dual agent. Or if you're writing an offer on a listing that is in your office under your broker, you're also a dual agent. You may not know the buyer. You may not even know the seller when you're writing your offer, and you may not know the other agent in our office, but the law deems us dual agents anyway. Okay, any questions on that? So you explain that to your client, and then you have your client sign here as buyer, and you date it, and then you put in our company DRE here after Keller Williams LA Harbor, which is 015-01084. Then you sign your name and you put your personal license number there. Okay, that's all. Okay, you know that. The second page of the agency disclosure is just explaining the law that I just ran through real quickly.
And by the way, Sal, they have, when they bundled this, like when I started, they didn't have all these documents bundled in zip forms, but they have the agency disclosure forms first because you're declaring that before you're actually writing the purchase agreement.
Yeah, the law requires that before your client signs anything, you have them sign the agency disclosure that you've explained that to them. Now, the other form here is the, it's blocked at the top, but it's, is that the wire? Oh, here it is. Notice of possible representation of more than one buyer or more than one seller. We're also required to have our buyer sign this disclosure, which basically says they understand that there's other agents and even in our own office that may be representing buyers, and submitting offers on the very same property. And that if that other agent in our office happens to sell it, that they understand that we don't have control over that. This form came into origination when a buyer didn't understand that just because we're a dual agent doesn't mean that we have control over what the seller does. Seller can take another agent's offer, even if it's not as good as our offer. If the seller prefers it, they're allowed to take that other offer, whether it's in our office or a different brokerage. So when they sign this, they're saying, I understand that, and I'm not going to blame you. Now, if you personally have two buyers on the same property and you're writing two offers, you need to let both buyers know, because they may object to you representing someone else. And for sure they're going to say, well, will you tell me what the other client's offering? And you can't do that. And you'd have to say, no, I can't tell them what you're offering, and I can't tell you what they're offering. So they might say, well, I don't want you to represent both of us. Either that guy gets another agent or I get another agent. So that happens very, very rarely. But just so that you know, you shouldn't let it go unsaid if that's the case. Any questions? All right. Next form is fraud, electronic funds. These are the instructions of what they're to do, and you should read it and know what it is. We have had a couple of instances where our agents got duped a little bit by a scam, and funds got waylaid into a Cayman Island account. We can't get them back. So in one case, we found out the very same hour that the funds were fraudulently emailed, and so that buyer got a hold of their bank and stopped that transfer of funds, and he saved that money. But a few years ago, some money did slip through the cracks and there was an issue. So this is a big deal. Read it so that your buyer can be sure that when he wires his funds, that they're being wired to the correct location. No questions? Good. Then we'll get right into the meat and potatoes. This is our RPA, residential purchase agreement. Now, we have income purchase agreements and mobile home purchase agreements and commercial purchase agreements and vacant land purchase agreements. This is the one we use mostly. And the other ones are similar enough so that you could use them. But I'm always available to you when you run into an unfamiliar situation, and Rock is as well, and so's Gordon. And if you're brand new, you probably have a coach or a mentor that you could turn to. But we're just going to go over the residential purchase agreement today for single family residences and condominiums. All right, so be sure that you put your date that you're completing this at the top of the page. You put your buyer's names and the full address in the city and the zip code. I always put the assessor's parcel number here, and you'll find it on the multiple listing. And if the property is not listed, you can just go to the tax records and get the APN number, assessor's parcel number. Okay? Then when you write in the offer price, the number, it'll auto-populate in here the written amount. Okay? Now looking here at the close of escrow, most escrows today are going 30 to 45 days. An escrow could be 10 or 15 days if it's an all cash offer, or if the buyer has a lender that's already done all the work and they can get the appraisal right away and get everything done right away. It's possible to do it in 20, 21 days, but normally 30 to 45, and you should be talking with your buyer and your lender very closely to find out what the lender needs to get that particular file loan closed. That's why you want to have your buyer pre-qualified, your lender ready have 2 years tax returns on them, already has all pages of their bank statements, already has a current credit report and their current funds in escrow. Their deposit to go in escrow right away, and all their funds to close are available immediately. Is that clear? Okay. Stop me anytime. All right, so there you go. Now, confirmation of agency relationship. The selling brokerage firm is the listing firm. So you'll have the seller's real estate company on this line, and they'll be representing the seller exclusively unless it's our company. Then, of course, we're a dual agent. So we're going to assume you're writing it for the purposes of this purchase agreement that we're looking at. We're going to assume that you're writing an offer on another company's listing. You're going to put that other company's license number in here, and that other agent's name here, and that other agent's individual license number here. Both of these numbers are in the multiple listing so that you can find them easily. The rare case that it's not listed and you're selling an off-market property, the other broker will give you their numbers when you write the offer. Worst case, you'll get them in the course of the negotiations. And then you'll put our company name here, and it's a good idea to put Keller Williams Realty LA Harbor, because there's a lot of Keller Williams Realty. There's Keller Williams Long Beach, Keller Williams Torrance, Keller Williams PV, Keller Williams Coastal, et cetera, et cetera. And you're with Keller Williams LA Harbor. And here's our license number for our office. 010, it's 015-01084. Okay. Then you're going to put your name here. You're going to put X's in our company's representing the buyer, and you are the agent. You're representing the buyer, and you put your personal real estate license number here. I made up a number here, but you would have yours in here. All right. Now let me tell you, today it's so competitive. We recommend you write a 3% deposit here. In this case, when I did work this up as a sample, I just put a 2% deposit. You see that? 2% of 500,000 is 10,000. I recommend 2-3%. Okay, no questions? Great. Then depending on the total down, whether you're having 5% down or 3.5 if it's an FHA offer, or 5% conventional, or 10%, or 15 or 20%, you would put the loan in here, whether it's a FHA 96.5% loan, or a conventional 95%, or a 90, or an 85, or an 80, whatever it is, you put that in here. And then it'll auto-populate the remainder of your down payment here. Once it calculates your deposit, your loan, and your price, it'll auto-populate the remainder of the down. So today, you might say your buyer will accept the best available rate. If you're going to put interest rate in here, I recommend you put it just slightly higher than the current rate your lender says he's going to get. If he's going to get a 3% loan, you might want a 3% interest. You might want to say 3.25. If it's a condo and he's getting 3.25 rate, you might want to say 3.5. So you prepare your client for some slight movement in that interest rate. They'll agree to that at the beginning. It'll make your job a lot easier. If the rate moves, a 1/10 or 0.2%, they won't pull their hair out. All right, and they'll move forward with the transaction. And the listing agent is going to want to see that you didn't put such a low tight rate that he can get out of it. He can say, well, I didn't get my 3%, so I'm canceling. They're trying to button down the transaction right away and have a good secure deal. Does everybody understand that reasoning? All right, that means yes, you do. All right. Oops, sorry, this is very touchy. So there you are. That you need to read all of this so you'll understand it. Let me see. If you've got an FHA loan, you'll put a check in this box here under 3D1. Put FHA. If it's a VA loan here, there's very little seller financing today, and so if it's not any of these, you just leave it alone, and it'll be referring to conventional financing, normal.
Sal, real quick, if you don't mind, what I like to tell everybody, if you're doing your garden variety deal, you almost don't have to check any boxes. Because like in the loan, it says conventional financing, which is going to be most of the time. So you don't really need to check anything. It's only if it's FHA, VA, or something special. And that is sort of true throughout the entire document.
That's good point, Rock. So there you go. Let's go to D3 here tells you a little bit if it's FHA or VA. There's some other minor terms. All right, looking at the second page, you should be, there's an X in this box, verification of down payment and closing costs. You absolutely should, with your offer, supply either a pre-qualification letter from the lender or a pre-approval letter from the lender or a desktop underwriting loan approval from the lender, as well as a bank statement, proof of funds, showing all of the down payment and closing costs. And depending on the down and the type of loan, closing costs might be $8, $10, $12, $15,000 or more. So the buyer is expected to have the closing costs. It's not a contingency. He can't say, oh, I can't close because I don't have enough closing costs. He could lose his deposit. All right, any questions? Oh, good. Now, appraisal contingency, if you don't, if it's not an all cash deal, or if the buyer doesn't have, if a buyer has an extremely large down and he wants to remove his appraisal contingency, he can put an X here in this box saying the appraisal is not a contingency because I've got 50% down, for example, and I don't think the loan's going to be a problem, or the appraisal will be a problem. Or I have enough money to increase my down if the appraisal comes in short. And with the prices almost rising weekly, that contingency is important for most buyers because they usually just have the money down in closing costs and they don't have another 10, 20, 30, or 40 grand to make up for an appraisal that falls short. Does everybody understand that reasoning? Right.
Can I ask a question, just kind of recapping what you said? So if your buyer does have the cash to make up, so if you look it up and you see, oh, well, it looks like the comp should come in at 475. They put in an offer at 500 and they do have the cash to make the difference and they're willing to, could you waive that appraisal contingency safely?
Well, you could, and here's the two things I recommend. When you show proof of funds to the listing agent and the seller, you show the additional funds. You say, hey, you know, we've got 100,000 down on this $500,000 offer, but here's another $75,000 that we have in the bank for closing costs. And if the appraisal comes in short, we can put the difference up, and we will. I had a buyer write an offer on one of my listings, said that I will, if the appraisal comes in short, I'll pay up to $10,000 or $20,000 above the appraisal with this additional cash I have down. So he limited it to 10 or 20, but if you have plenty of money, you don't have to limit it. You could say, hey, here's the other 100,000 I have in the bank, and I remove my appraisal contingency, and I'll use what I need to meet the appraisal.
Thank
So
you.
that answers your question?
Yes.
Good. So sometimes in a counteroffer, they'll ask you to get that appraisal done in 12 days, 10 days. Be careful if you're shortening your appraisal time, because you may have to order the appraisal immediately upon going into escrow in order to get it done in 10 or 12 days. They're backed up too. Okay? All right. Now, your loan contingency here, standard is 21 days. A good lender, usually if you've given him the 2 years tax returns and the up-to-date bank statements for 2 months and the up-to-date pay stubs and proof of funds and a good solid current credit report, they usually can get them approved in 21 days. So that's the reason why you want to be sure that your lender and you and the buyer are in close contact, and you know exactly to what extent the lender is prepared to get it approved. You can get a loan approved subject to the appraisal coming in. You might even, I've gotten loan approval before the appraisal was done. So you might want to be careful about shortening that loan approval, because I personally am not an advocate of removing a contingency before you're assured of the ability to remove it. Like you got the appraisal in and you know that it hit value. You have a formal loan approval from your lender and he tells you can remove your loan contingency. So oftentimes a listing agent will ask you to remove it when the time comes. Your options are to remove it and gamble on the loss of the deposit, ask for an extension of time for a few days, or refuse to remove it and gamble that they may or may not cancel the deal. All right? Keep that in mind. Just because the 17 days or the 21 days are up, that's not an automatic removal of the contingency. Your buyer has to sign that removal. And I think he shouldn't until he's certain. But if he chooses to remove it because he's anxious and wants to secure the property, he's endangering his deposit. And you should make sure that you've disclosed that to him in an email or in a text, that you could prove you told him or her or them, so that you're not remiss in that duty. Okay, moving on. Just a second, I'm sorry. Now, you by the way, you only got 2 hours. I'm only going to highlight some things here, but you need to read the entire contract, especially if you're new and you've only written a deal or two. There's something that I say in every purchase agreement class. It's kind of trite, but I believe it. I'm going to repeat it again. The RPA is either your best friend or your worst enemy. If you don't understand what it says and what your buyers and sellers are committing themselves to, you can put yourself in a bad position when trying to explain how you didn't understand that this could happen to them. Because if you're writing offers and you're making $5, $10, $15, $20, $30, $50,000, they have the right to expect that you know this RPA backward and forward. Wouldn't you agree? So read it. And by the way, there's a book at the Board of Realtors, maybe $30, that explains this purchase agreement as Rock says, line by line. And I even turn to it sometimes. You're welcome to call me, Gordon, your mentor, Rock, your coach, or any highly experienced agent in the company if you're relatively new. And I'd say anything under 10 transactions is relatively new. So some people catch on to it real quick and read every word and understand it, and others don't. So we're here for you. So moving down to paragraph 7 here. Usually we ask the seller to pay for the hazard zone disclosure. We ask of course, the buyer is going to pay for his own physical inspection and any inspections they want. Some buyers will say, well, I want a roof inspection, an electrical inspection, a plumbing inspection, a foundation inspection, and a general physical inspection. They can do that and pay for all of those, but they have to do it within the time period they've agreed, or ask for an extension, which the listing agent and the seller do not have to grant you. Okay. And usually today, a buyer doesn't bring up seller to do the termite work because it's such a competitive market. The buyer likes to just say, I reserve the right to do my inspections and I'll pay for them within the time frame, and then I'll approve or disapprove the property or request repairs or termite work or credit or whatever I want to satisfy me, and the buyer and seller can come to an agreement on those requests or not. And then the deal can cancel and the buyer can get his entire deposit back, but the buyer doesn't get any inspection fees back. Everybody understand that? All right. Let's see. That's enough for that page. On page 3, we usually ask the seller to pay for, smoke detectors and retrofit water heaters, trapping, and in LA City, earthquake gas valves on the gas meter, and safety glass, tempered glass on the sliding doors, and those type of things. So those are like low flow toilets, minimum mandatory government retrofit things. Most sellers are prepared to do that. And most of the time, we request in the offer for the seller to do those things. Occasionally, a buyer will say, I'll do this. I'll put in the low flow toilets. I'll put in the smoke detectors and the carbon monoxide detectors, and I'll make sure that the tempered glass on the sliding door, I'll accept it untempered, and so trying to make their offer a little bit more favorable to the seller. Okay, so, but if you read this, you need to explain to your buyer what it says so they can decide if they want the seller to do it, which is kind of customary, but not always in this kind of a fast, aggressive market. Some buyers offer to do that. Moving down to escrow, it's customary that they each pay their own escrow fees, and it's customary that the sellers and listing broker choose the service companies like the escrow and the title company. So when I write an offer, I don't make that a point of contention. I simply say seller's choice on escrow, seller's choice on title company. All right. Now here on other, buyer or seller to pay county transfer tax. You can write down someplace if you don't know, LA County transfer tax are $1.10 per 1,000 of the sale price. So a $500,000 sale would be what? That $550, $1.10 per 1,000. Let me see. 500 times $1.10 is 550. So we're asking the seller to pay that. Now, if it's in the city, LA City is $4.50 per 1,000 of the sale price. So times 500, that's $2,250. Some sellers will ask the buyer to pay half of that. Some buyers will offer to pay half. Some buyers will offer to pay all of it. It depends, but they should know how much it is and what they're asking the seller to do. And in a balanced market, customarily the seller pays those. But in this market, it doesn't always happen that way. Let's see. If it's a condominium, We could ask the seller to pay for the HOA preparation of documents to get all of the HOA documents to the buyer. So keep that in mind. That's customary. But it's good to mention it here and put a check in the box so they know. The seller's going to have to get those HOA documents for any buyer that comes along. Okay. Here on D10 for the home warranty, everybody should have to know some kind of a booklet on whatever home warranty company you're going to use. I use First American, but there's a lot of good home warranty companies, and you should know what that particular property has. Does it have air conditioning? Does it have a pool? Are they going to leave the refrigerator and the washer and dryer? So that you'll know what kind of warranty you're going to ask for. If you're going to mark air conditioning or pool or other appliances, so that you put the correct amount there. If the buyer wants to ask for the refrigerator and the washer and dryer, and it has air conditioning and a pool, you may want to ask for the seller to pay for the coverage, which is additional for air conditioning, pool, freestanding refrigerator, and washer and dryer. So you need to know and understand these costs, fees, and what you get and what they cost. Got that? Good. Thanks. Now, down here is where you would ask for what you want. Normally, built-in stoves are included, obviously, and dishwashers and garbage disposals. They're expected to stay with the property because they're attached. But sometimes a stove is a freestanding, and buyer thinks it's supposed to stay, and the seller thinks it's supposed to go with him. Doesn't hurt to say, put an X in stoves. And if they offer the fridge, or even if they don't and you want to ask for it, you have to put an X in here. Can you see my cursor moving around the page? Yes, good. And if you want the washer and dryer, you put an X here. And if there's any additional items, you may be asking for a flat screen TV or some other appliance, a portable dishwasher, or I can't imagine, maybe a wine fridge. It may be built in and it may be freestanding. If there's a special opening made for a wine refrigerator, it's supposed to be included. Sometimes the sellers don't know that, so it's best, if you're expecting it to be included, to mention it here so that there's no discussion about whether it is or it isn't included. If they want to exclude it, they can exclude it in a counter. Your buyer can accept that exclusion or not, move forward or not. No questions? Great. So once again, you should read this whole thing so you know what you're agreeing to. Now down here on possession of the property, if you don't, as Rock pointed out, if you don't put any checks in here, that means the buyer's expecting to have possession of the property delivered by 6 p.m. on the day of the close of escrow. Now, I had a buyer, I was a dual agent, and the buyer asked for possession at 12:30 in the afternoon of the closing, and the seller agreed to a 2:30 possession. And at 2:30, the seller wasn't out. The buyer was there with his moving van, and the garage happened to be open, and the buyer was a single man and the seller was a single woman. And at 2:30, they had a confrontation. He's starting to move stuff into the garage, intimidating her, and she is calling me, and she's being intimidated, and she wants to call the police, and he's photographing her, screaming at him, and it got confrontational. So I ran over to the house and I brought this, and I told my buyer, look, the seller has until 6 p.m. today Now, she said she tried to get out earlier, and she's trying to do that, but he kind of calmed down a little bit because he didn't understand that he agreed to this 6 p.m. and the 2:30 was just an accommodation. So actually, I had to finish helping her move her small personal belongings out of the house. But then she wanted to stay there till 6, and she got angry, and he's angry, and I'm trying to stay calm. But I helped her get out by about 2:30, 2:45, and she drove away. And he's threatening to sue her and sue me. And so you need to know your contract. You need to explain to your buyers things that we know and take for granted. This is usually either their first transaction or their first transaction within the last 5 or 10 years. And even if they had one 2 years ago, they didn't pay attention to these small terms that are important that you need to know about so you can advise them calmly. And if they understand this ahead of time, it's going to be a lot less trouble for them and for you. So once again, buy that book, understand the contract, read the small print. All right, page 4, there's not too much here. If a property has a tenant, a single family house or condo has a tenant in possession, I recommend that, and it's supposed to be vacant at the close, I recommend that you write into your contract, property to be vacant, not from the owner. This is if there's a tenant or a child or somebody other than the owner in the property. Property to be vacant 10 days prior to the close of escrow and prior to the buyer's verification of property condition, which is the buyer's walkthrough. That way, you don't find yourself with a tenant that's supposed to move out by 6 o'clock on the day of the close that's not leaving. Does everybody understand what I'm saying? All right. Nobody's asking a question. So be careful. Now, if a tenant is going to remain in possession or a buyer is going to remain in possession for a few days, you have to have some type of a form, either seller remains in possession. I think it's SIP, seller in possession, or tenant, a rental agreement with the tenant. And if the owner is staying for like some weeks or a month, you should have a rental agreement with a deposit signed. And the deposit should be in the hands of the buyer so that the buyer has some security if they move out and trash it in the move out, or if they don't move out on time and there's a few days of rent that's owed. And if they are staying there and they're paying rent, you should see to it that the first, whatever time they're staying, a week or 2 or 3 or a month, that money is paid in rent to the buyer through escrow. The more money that a buyer gets, your buyer especially, up front at the close for a rent back or an in possession, the better your buyer will be and the less problems you're going to have if there's a delay in moving. Anybody not understand that? Okay. So all the rest of this, all the statutory and other disclosures, lead-based paint, et cetera, you should read and understand. If you're using a transaction coordinator and she's a good one, experienced, she's going to know the disclosures that are required on your transaction. But sometimes there's agents that are a little bit lazy and they don't understand what's needed and they turn everything over to their transaction coordinator. And it's okay to have a transaction coordinator, but you need to understand and know what they're going to do for you so that you don't miss something and paint yourself into a corner. Next page. Okay, every property is sold in its present as is condition. And unless a seller agreed beforehand or in writing or in the purchase agreement to do something specific, they're not obligated to do anything. If you didn't ask for termite, it could be infested. You can ask for it after your inspection, and you could come to an agreement on what they will or will not do, and you can buy it or not buy it. But initially, the agreement is as is, and the seller is not obligated to make any repairs. And that's real clear. It could be something obvious and glaring, a giant window in the front of the house, 8 by 10 feet, it's broken. And the buyer can assume, obviously, the seller's going to replace that. No, not unless you ask for it in the offer and have him agree. Now, a buyer could buy it without asking for anything and then ask for everything they want in the request for repairs after the inspection. Okay, so this will tell you buyer has a right to inspect, buyer has a right to ask for anything they want. Seller has a right to refuse it. They can come to an agreement or not and move forward or cancel. Buyer can get their deposit back. If they have not removed their inspection contingency, they can ultimately disapprove the property and get their deposit back, but not their inspection fees. Next page, read all of this. All right. Time periods. It says here the seller has 7 days to deliver what they need to the buyer. It might be CC&Rs, rules and regulations, for a condominium, or they may have some inspection reports or termite reports or city reports. They have that time period to deliver that to the buyer. And here it's written in here, the buyer has 17 days to do their inspections that are called out here in this paragraph B1, 1 through 5. Oftentimes, I tell my buyers I think they should do their inspection within the first 2 to 5 days of the contract, so that they have time to analyze it, to approve or disapprove, or come to an agreement with the seller on the repairs or credits, so that you can hurry up and order the appraisal, so you can get that done within the 17 days or 15 or 12 that you may have agreed to. So it's important that sometimes I'll even just put in there 10 days or 7 days. Now, let me tell you right now, a lot of the good inspectors and a lot of the inspectors, the market's so busy that you may find out they don't even have an availability for 5 or 6 or 7 days. So you may need to check with 4, 5, 6, 7, or 8 inspectors to find one that's available in the next 2 to 5 days. Or choose one, and then if he's kind of late, 7 or 10 days, you're not leaving you much time to do your request for repairs and come to an agreement and get your appraisal ordered. Some buyers in this market will order their appraisal right away to make sure they'll get it done in 7 to 10 days, and then take a chance on approving, coming to an agreement on the request for repairs on the inspection. The more you know, and the more advice you get from the experienced agents, the better you can advise your buyer on what they should do and what the time frames are and how quickly they should move along. Any questions there or concerns? Okay. Moving down to 14D, seller's right to cancel, and if a time frame comes along, like 10 days to do the inspection, or 17 days on the appraisal, or 21 days on the loan, if the seller doesn't say anything to the buyer, that contingency period just goes on and on. But nowadays, they're very on top of these contingency timeframes, and they might very well give you a notice to perform 2 days before that time is up, saying, hey, you've got 2 days to remove your inspection contingency. So be aware, we want you to remove it, or we can have the right to cancel if you don't remove it by the time frame. We give you your deposit back, but we have the right to cancel. And if they have a buyer waiting in the wings with a higher offer, all cash, they might very well cancel if you have it performed on time. So don't assume you're going to get an extension of time, especially in this market. So that goes for the inspection, the appraisal, and the loan contingency. Now, the buyer also has some rights. Buyer could ask for repairs, and a seller doesn't have to respond to a request for repairs. Most of them do, but a buyer can then say, I want your response within 2 days of today, whenever it is, or I have the right to cancel. And what they're each saying is they have the right to cancel. They didn't necessarily say, I'm going to cancel. So once again, if you read these paragraphs carefully, you will detect the fine wording, and you won't assume that something's going to happen automatically, or that you don't have to do something, or that you do have to do something. The contract is very concise, and it is very beneficial when we understand each paragraph. All right? And that's why you could call me or Gordon or experienced agents or your coach or Rock or your mentor if you're relatively new. Okay? But notice has to be given to cancel. A buyer can ask for the world in a request. I want you to reduce your house by 50 grand, put on a new roof, and paint it inside and out. And the seller can go, you know what, I'm canceling this deal. Seller can't cancel. What the seller has to do is respond in writing and say, I'm not going to do any of this, and you have 2 days to accept it, or I have the right to cancel. Understand that? All right. And then once contingencies are removed, it explains here the effect of buyer's removal of contingencies. Once you remove the inspection contingency after approving the condition or coming to an agreement on the credit or the repairs, if you remove the inspection contingency, you can't go back and talk about the condition and ask for something unless the seller gives the buyer a new disclosure. Say, while they're in escrow, I don't know, the roof leaks. He has to tell them, hey, I got a roof leak. I don't want to repair it. The buyer can say, I want a new roof, or I want it repaired, or I can cancel and get my deposit back. Now they can do, well, you removed your contingencies. I removed my contingencies before you gave me a new disclosure about the property that I wasn't aware of. See, new disclosures give the buyer more time and gives the buyer the right to then cancel if they don't come to an agreement on the new resolution of the new disclosure. That sounds clear? Good.
Hey, Sal, I had to drop off for half an hour. Can you go back to page 2?
Where am I?
You're on page 6. Or you were on page 6.
I did that for, here we are, we're on 6. Close of escrow. So the close of escrow is a target date. You want to stay on that target date. It doesn't always fall on that date. Sometimes a buyer or seller will ask to close a little bit earlier or a little bit later. Normally they agree. Very occasionally, a buyer can't get his loan docs on time, and he can't get them signed and closed and funds in escrow, and it runs over a little bit. Usually the seller will go along with that. Usually they won't give you a notice. You have 3 days to close your escrow. I'm going to cancel. If they've gone through a 30-day escrow, they don't usually want to cancel it if it didn't close on time, unless they have a very good reason. Property went up 100,000 in the last 5 days, or they have a buyer all cash for more money to close it in 10 days, or they don't want to sell it anymore because something changed in their life. But they do have the right to give a notice to close escrow within 3 days, or they'll cancel. It's rare, but just so that you know, they could threaten to do that. You know, usually they don't. They come to an agreement. Sometimes they're going to ask for a little bit more money from the buyer to extend. Okay, so nothing is set in concrete. The contract may give them the right to cancel, may try to cancel, but the buyer might also get an attorney and try to put less pendants on the property. So it's nice to keep everything on schedule so you don't have those kind of problems.
And we all know that Liz Pendants is Liz Snyder's maiden name.
If you don't know what Liz Pendants is, it's a procedure where a person could tie up a property and keep it from selling to anyone else while there's litigation pending. That's what les pendens means. It might be Latin, I don't know, but it means litigation pending and the property's tied up. Now, if somebody puts a les pendens on a property improperly, they can get in a great deal of trouble. So you don't throw that around freely, but just as a little point of information for you. If here on cancellation, if one of the parties gives a notice to perform and the other party doesn't perform, they have the right to cancel according to the contract and law. And if they move forward with the cancellation and the deposit is under the terms of the contract goes to one party or the other, if they don't agree to give it to the party who's entitled to it, there could be, for example, if the seller doesn't give the deposit back to the buyer who canceled based on not approving the condition, or based on the appraisal not coming in and it was a contingency he didn't remove, or based on being turned down for the loan, provided he didn't remove his loan contingency, the buyer would be entitled to cancel and get their deposit back. If the seller refused to give the buyer back the deposit that the buyer is entitled to under the contract, the seller could be, down here at the bottom, could be liable for an additional $1,000 for refusing to sign the cancellation to give the buyer back his deposit. By the same token, if the buyer had removed all contingencies and did not close escrow because they found a better house, or they changed their mind, or they got cold feet after removing all contingencies, the seller could cancel and get that deposit. And if the seller refuses to give the buyer the deposit, the seller can proceed against the buyer, for additional $1,000. Now, on an owner-occupied buyer's property, the buyer is limited to the 3% deposit, in a cancellation, in a dispute. But it's good to know this, because when I've explained this to my buyers and sellers, this paragraph, they become a lot more cooperative in doing the right thing. One of my buyers moved out of their property before the close of escrow, and we had a $12,000 deposit in escrow. And the buyer put in the rest of their funds to close, and the wife quit her job a week before the escrow closed, and their lender verified employment, prior to the funding and discovered the wife had quit her job. It changed their qualifying ability. The lender pulled the loan, did not close. My seller had moved out, was irate. And the buyer wouldn't release the $12,000 deposit to the seller, which all contingencies were removed. And we informed him that we can get another 1,000. And as a matter of fact, being they had put all of their money, all $125,000 in escrow, we told them, until we get that $12,000, we're not going to release any of your money. And we're going to sue you for that $1,000 and more damages. So the next day we had cancellation of escrow and my buyer had a $12,000. My seller had the $12,000 check. But it did cost them $4,000 to move out and move back in. So they're $8,000 ahead. And we sold it for the same price. So they actually got $8,000 more for their inconvenience. But understanding this and having the buyer over the barrel, I was representing the seller. You might be representing a buyer and you might tell your buyer, you messed up and they're going to hold your deposit. But sometimes a buyer and seller agree to split the deposit just to be done with each other. Once in a while, a seller released the deposit because they have a buyer on the line and they don't want to fight over the deposit for months. But it's good to understand this and understand they might go to mediation and arbitration, and it could tie up their money and the sale. All right. Page 7. Repairs. If the buyer asks for repairs and the seller does the repairs, the buyer will verify that at the walkthrough at the end of escrow. But let me caution you guys, write this down. If my buyer will accept financial credit in lieu of repairs, that's what I do. The reason I do that, and you don't have to, the reason I do that is A, the seller may not have done the repairs properly or to the satisfaction of my buyer, and we don't want to find that out 5 days before the close of escrow. May have had a handyman do a big electrical job that should have had permits and a professional licensed electrician to do it. So also, if you're going to ask for a repair and you're not going to get money, you want to be sure to say something like, seller to have a licensed electrician replace the circuit breaker box with comparable or improved circuit breakers and with city permits, and to supply the permits and the invoice to the buyer after the repair. So you see how really technical I was, or seller to have a licensed plumber do this and that plumbing repair, and if permits are required, to provide the buyer with signed off city permits and invoice prior to the close of escrow, or a licensed roofer to replace or repair the roof, maybe certify the repair, and if permits were required, to supply the buyer with permits and the invoice. Do you understand why? So that you have somebody to go back at. You can tell the plumber, hey, here's your invoice. You said you replaced 12 feet of sewer line and you didn't. So you can hold somebody responsible. And that's why you may want to get a credit so that the buyer can see to it that it's done the way the buyer wants it done. And even if you're just replacing a small broken window, if a seller does it himself and it's a real sloppy job and he didn't paint it, you don't want to get into a confrontation in the week of the close of escrow. So keep that in mind when you ask for repairs or credits. Be specific. When I'm a listing agent and a buyer says, something like, seller to do, see page 3, 4, and 5 of the inspection report. I don't agree to some vague request. The seller to deal with items 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, and 10 on the inspection. What do you mean deal with? Are you talking about put some electrical tape over it? Are you talking about paint it? What do you mean deal with it? So be careful with vague requests. When you request, be extremely specific. And if you're the listing agent, either you give a credit, maybe you change repairs to a credit, or you respond with, seller will replace the dripping faucet, the dripping faucet in the master bath. Seller will have a window company replace the broken window. Seller will have an electrician repair the double tap in the electrical box. Don't be careful about vague requests. And sometimes they need seller to do this, seller to do that, and then the seller does it himself, and it's just shouldn't have been done himself. So be specific. What was the other thing? Oh, regarding credits, before I pass this, a lender usually will not allow a buyer to get a credit for more than their closing costs. You might get a $20,000 credit and the buyer's closing cost is $12,000. And at the end, you find out your buyer's not getting that last $8,000 because his lender's saying, you're not going to get a cash kickback at the end. You put your money down and your closing cost, and then the seller gives you $8,000 too? No, they won't approve that. So be careful about how much of a credit you ask for your buyer. And also, a lender doesn't want to see money for repairs. If you're getting a credit, say, for example, when you ask Mike, say it's your offer and it's my listing, and you ask seller to replace the roof, put a new electrical box in, and I might come back and say, no, seller property be sold in its present as is condition, no repairs to be done, and seller will credit buyer $15,000 towards buyer's closing costs, but property is sold as is. Well, if your buyer has $15,000, $16,000, or $17,000 in closing costs, that's fine. You can accept that. And the amendment that comes out of escrow that the lender will see is going to say, seller credit buyer $15,000 towards closing costs. There's no mention of what it's for because it's for closing costs. Property sold as is, there are no repairs and no agreement to repairs. I specifically said property sold as is, no repairs, but seller will credit buyer $15,000 towards closing costs. Lender doesn't want to see $15,000 of repairs. They're going to tell you, we're not going to fund this loan. Now you have to do the repairs. You don't want to find that out in the last week of escrow either. Let me see if there's something else about this. If the seller's closing costs are only $10,000, you might respond back and say, seller to reduce sale price by $5,000 and to credit buyer $10,000 towards closing costs. So you see how you dealt with that? Common sense, but sometimes in the heat of negotiations or the excitement of getting a credit, or a very happy buyer or a very happy seller, you miss something. A lot of what you do in real estate is to foresee a pitfall, to foresee a landmine in front of you and to avoid it with the way you negotiate the deal and the credits and the price reductions and the repairs. So that's why when you're brand new, you're going to have a mentor, because it's better to have a part of the commission than no commission, or a no commission and a lawsuit. Okay. Page 8. Now, most buyers and sellers initial the liquidated damage clause. And what it says is buyer and seller agree if the buyer defaults, the seller can keep the deposit. And if this is a buyer buying a single family residence that he's going to occupy, or buying a residence that the seller's occupying, the buyer can only forfeit up to 3% of the purchase price. So if a buyer deposits a 10% deposit to show that I really want to buy this and I'm a great buyer, and then the buyer removes the appraisal contingency, the inspection contingency, the loan contingencies, and all contingencies, and then cancels, that's a default. And the seller's entitled to his deposit. But the buyer is going to move into that single family residence. 3% is the only amount that the seller can keep, even though the deposit may be 10%. And most buyers, almost every single contract that crosses my desk, the buyer and seller initial that. Now, sometimes the buyer or the seller do not want to initial that. You need to be aware of one of them not wanting to initial it, and you should find out why one of them doesn't want to initial it. In one case, I don't know if it was the buyer or the seller that didn't want to initial it, but one of our agents here had this deal, and that client was an attorney. And you could see that an attorney might say, hey, I don't want to initial this. I want to have the advantage. And if there's something goes sideways here, I want the advantage. I could drag this through court for years. I don't have to pay an attorney. So the TC and our agent thought it was just an oversight, and they opened escrow. And then I pointed it out. I said, hey, only one client signed the liquidated damage. Okay, it was probably an oversight. I'm going to go ahead and tell the other agent to get their client to initial it. Turns out the other client said, no, I intentionally didn't initial it. Well, our counter offer, there was a counter offer in this transaction. Our counter offer says, if there's a paragraph in this contract that requires two initials, both initials, and one of the parties didn't initial it, then that paragraph is excluded from this contract. See where the small print, if you're not aware how you could get painted into a corner. So now our client panicked. Our client was the buyer, because I remember how we solved this problem. Panic and go, oh my God, I don't want to buy this if they're not going to initial that. They're an attorney and I'm at a disadvantage and I'm extremely uncomfortable. So here's what we did. We said, you can't cancel it. You signed the counter, and that's the deal. Well, what do? I said, well, when you do your physical inspection, you disapprove the property, you ask for an enormous price reduction and all of the repairs you want. Then when the seller says, no, I don't agree, I want to cancel, you have your cancellation. They go, great, good idea. What if the buyer says, well, wait a minute, what if the seller, I don't want to cancel, but I want to counter back. I won't reduce it 50 grand, but I'll make the repairs. Then you can respond to that and say, well, I'll tell you what, you initial that paragraph, I'll accept the repairs, and you don't have to give me the 50 grand. And we resolved it, and they agreed, and we were okay. But we did paint ourselves in the corner because we weren't paying attention. We got out of it, just we were lucky. Okay, so be careful and understand what that paragraph says. Now, this paragraph, mediation, in short, what it says is whether or not you initial this paragraph or that paragraph, you're both agreeing that should a dispute arise out of this contract, that you agree to mediate first prior to going to arbitration or to a lawsuit. And you understand if either one of you skips this agreement to mediate first and you go to arbitration or lawsuit and you win, you're not entitled to attorney's fees. So that is to encourage people to mediate. And true mediation happens first between the two agents. As soon as a little issue arises, the two agents talk and arrive at how are we going to work out this dispute between the buyer and the seller. And most of the time, the dispute is going to be resolved between the buyer and seller and the two agents, especially if the agents are good, smart agents, knowledgeable and professional and not vindictive. You know, they really want to work towards an amiable agreement. However, if they can't, then mediation takes place legitimate and they pay for it. I don't know what it costs, $300, $400, $500, $600 a party. Sometimes when the party realizes it's $300, $400, $500, $600, $700 each, they become more reasonable, especially if the problem is smaller than a $300, $400, $500, or $600 problem. But occasionally they pay and they go to mediation. Understand that mediation does not tell you you're right and you're wrong and this is how it's going to be. What mediation does is mediate. They help them come to an agreement, which the agents tried to do and they were unreasonable. Now they had to pay to have somebody else tell them, look, what's it going to take for you to work this out? Then you go to the other side. What's it going to take what will you accept to come to an agreement on this? And they usually do what they should have done earlier, come to an agreement on how to work it out. If
Now,
they don't,
I thought it was your wife who told you if you were right or wrong.
That's right. That's who rules my house. Just ask her. So the thing is, they usually work it out here. If they don't have to come to an agreement. Then they will go to lawsuit or arbitration. Now, moving down to paragraph 22B, if they initial the arbitration clause, they're agreeing to, if we don't work it out, if we have a dispute, we don't work it out in mediation, we're going to go to arbitration. And what arbitration is saying, if there's a dispute, we're not going to go to court and sue each other. We're going to go to an independent arbitration. We're going to pay for an arbitration. And the result of that arbitration is, number one, binding. Number two, you can't appeal it. You have to accept it and you move forward from there. So oftentimes, if one party knows their argument is weak, they don't want to go to arbitration because it's going to cost them money and they believe they're going to probably lose anyway. So it very seldom goes beyond mediation or arbitration. But if it goes to arbitration, that's what they've agreed to. They've agreed to not sue each other and they've agreed to accept the result or the ruling of the arbitration and it's final and binding. So read that carefully. There may be some exceptions in here, but read it so you know what they are. So I like my deals to have liquidated damage signed and arbitration signed. All right, page 9. Here's what I have to say about this. 30 definitions. What this is saying is these words in our contract, we are agreeing that they mean this definition. So they don't mean what you thought they meant or what you'd like them to mean. we're all agreeing that they mean what it says they mean here. And you'd be surprised how this comes in handy. When close of escrow, no matter what you think it means this. And copy means this. And days means this. And days after means this. And this is so important, just like every line of the contract. It's wonderful. CAR has created a great contract. And as a matter of fact, if a legal issue arises out of the wording in the contract, they are going to stand behind it and defend it at their expense. So it's a tremendous contract. What I said at the beginning, the better you understand every paragraph, the better you're going to represent your client, and the better you see this gray hair? I got this gray hair from 47 years of, well, I understand a contract for 20 years, but for the first 10 years of not understanding or caring to understand the contract. So get that book, read it, learn it, and you're going to be ahead of 1/3 to 1/2 of the agents out there. You're going to be more knowledgeable. You can't believe how many of us agents are earning $50, $75, $100, $150,000 a year, and they don't understand what I'm trying to teach you today. It'll frustrate you, but you'll be better off when you can tell them, you know what, days after means this. Look at paragraph 30G, and they can't argue with that. All right. Let's see what else we got. Now, be careful when you do a counter to check this box. We had an instance where we had an offer come in, and our agent countered the offer. This was before emails, and this was a long time ago, but just so that you're aware, because some people fax things. And they had their client sign the contract and initial the contract, and they had them sign the counter, and they send the contract and the counter, faxed it back to the other agent. The other agent tore up the counter, opened escrow on the original terms, not the counter terms. And our agent said, wait a minute. No, here's what happened. I remember they signed the back page of it and sent the back page and the counter. This is how we got out of it, which was a sloppy way to do it. But it was sloppy because they didn't check that box. So they had the whole offer that they had presented. They had this page signed, and they had the counter, which they tore up, and then opened escrow with their original offer and the one page signed. And they go, hey, you signed the contract and we didn't see any counter. And we go, oh my God, what are you talking about? Well, look, we got it right here. You didn't make any counter, you signed it. So Panic City, we got a big lawsuit, and that buyer is going to put a less pendants. And anyway, so we go to our attorney, and the attorney said, well, let me see your entire contract that you signed and your counter. Well, we sent it to them. It turns out that our listing agent didn't get all of the pages initialed and signed. So the attorney said, well, wait a minute. If all the pages aren't initialed and signed, there's no contract. So go back to that agent and say, well, show me your entire contract that's initialed and signed. And she couldn't because she didn't have it. So we got out of that mess. But the point was, don't forget to check that box. All right, so you got to be technical. Sometimes when I'm getting multiple offers and I'm stressed, I got a lot to do and I'm going to respond, before I even prepare the counter, I put an X in that box because I don't want to forget to put an X in that box. All right? All right. All right. So obviously you're going to sign all the additional forms that come with this. So we finished a little bit early. So I'm happy to take any questions or scenarios that you can come up with. What do we do if? But that's what we're here for. You can always call me. I take calls from the agents at night, at weekend when I'm away. If I can't call you back, leave me a message, text me. Gordon takes calls. Experienced agents in this office, we're all happy to help each other. Rock takes calls. So don't hesitate. We want you to be successful, and we want you to find this enjoyable and exciting. I found it enjoyable and exciting for 47 years. And you can make a good living, and I get my reward not only is making a living, is having people that appreciate me. And guess what? The more knowledgeable you are, the more confident you're going to sound, the more they appreciate you, the more they're going to give you return business and refer clients to you. Right now, most of my business is repeat and referral. Took a long time to get it, but most of it is repeat and referral. Because I treated my clients well. I didn't put the transaction or the brokerage commission ahead of doing the right thing for them. And they appreciate it, and they tell their friends. Questions? Oh, everybody wants to go home early, huh? Come on, ask me a difficult question. I can refer it back to Rock.
I have a quick question.
All right.
So you had mentioned about signatures and initials. So is it common practice to make sure everyone initials every page so it's proof that you've reviewed every page?
Absolutely.
Good.
Absolutely. Now, it's not uncommon to just send a counter to somebody and not the whole contract, but keep in mind that if you write an offer and if it's a multiple counter, say you write an offer on a hot listing and you get only the multiple counter back signed and not the purchase agreement, that's not so terrible because the seller is not obligated to accept your acceptance of that multiple counter. Even if you send it back signed, they can say, well, it says right here that the seller has the right to choose the multiple counter that they want. But keep this in mind. If they send you back just a counter to you and you sign it and send it back, you think you have a deal. And the next day they called you and they go, you know what? He got a better offer and he took it. And he goes, well, wait a minute. I got a counter here signed by both of you. Yes, but do you have the entire contract signed by everybody? You go, no. So you don't have a good case for arbitration or mediation. So if you do get a counter back, you immediately say, please send me the entire contract signed. And don't promise your buyer that it's all a done deal. So be careful until you get the fully executed purchase agreement and counter. You can't take it to the bank. Most agents are honorable, but sometimes it's the seller that's dishonorable. The seller might tell his listing agent, look, I just got a better offer and I don't want to live up to that counter that I sent Rock. So just give Rock the bad news, tell him to stuff it. I didn't sign the offer. So you follow me? Be thorough, basically. Next question.
I got a comment. I always tell people, when I write the first purchase offer with a buyer, I really like to do it in person. And I like to see eye to eye. I want to go through everything. I want to explain what we're doing. And, And that was good, Sal, because generally we never even get to the last page. So you talked about each page. So congratulations. So we're very clear. And in this day of DocuSign and all this other kind of stuff, I really want to be in person going over this. And then after that, any other offer we can DocuSign because we just sort of know what we're doing if it goes that way. But the first one, I really like to sit down and go over what we're doing. And explain the contingency periods and maybe even talk about what we might expect and things like that. Once you explain expectations and let them know what may happen in the future, that helps because that prepares them. And
absolutely, you're 100% correct. It's all about relationship, right? And one of the things that Rock made me think of is that we have attorney Steven Spear come in once a year. Last time he came in, it was a Zoom meeting, but our meetings are important, so attend them, even if it's by Zoom. At any rate, he said a lot of lawsuits come against agents because of a poor relationship and a poor communication. And a lot of agents are going so quick and they just want to send the paperwork and get it e-signed and sell it and put it in escrow and get the disclosure signed, close escrow and get their check. Rock's 100% correct. The attorney told us when there's a lawsuit and they pull you into court and they ask your client who's suing, well, how much time when did Sal sit down with you and go over the purchase agreement? And they say, well, he never did. He just sent it to me by email and I had to electronically sign it. Well, did he sit down and go over and explain? No, he didn't. And then if there's a disclosure and I was the listing agent and the buyer suing me and the seller for the disclosures I filled out, and I'm in the stand and the judge asks my client, well, when Sal sat down with you and went over the disclosures and explained everything, how much time did he? Actually, he didn't sit down with me with these disclosures. They all came online and I just initialed them. You see how bad I look? How much time did I spend with my client explaining the purchase agreement, explaining the disclosures? And the other thing I learned from a doctor friend of mine, he told me this. He says, you know what? Malpractice suits, whether a doctor did something wrong or not, a doctor with a good bedside manner has a lot less, malpractice suits. And a doctor with a poor bedside manner, even when he didn't do something wrong, has more malpractice suits, which relating to real estate is your relationship with your client, the time you spend with them, the explanations you give them, the knowledge you impart to them, all instills confidence. And when you know what you're doing and they understand what you've told them you're doing, the likelihood of them getting in a bind or you getting in a bind is slim. So I'm just reinforcing what Rock just told you.
So remember, if you took anything out of this class, have a good bedside manner.
Exactly, but not literally because. All right.
And by the way, because when I was started and I was a contract guy, I was fearful of this document because I figured somebody would say, explain this paragraph on page 9. No one asks you to explain the paragraph on page 9. You'll actually find out that people don't read much of anything. They just want to know the basics and let's go. And so when you calmly go through this in a rather expeditious manner, that's actually very helpful, but they're not going to ask a lot of details and that type of stuff. They may want to know what the contingency periods actually mean and what the threat to their deposit is. But outside of that, there's never really any detailed questions except the numbers that you're putting in.
All right. Any questions? Any more questions? Great. We're out of here early. Thank you very much. I'll be gone for a week, but I'll be available by cell, by command, and by email, but not every minute. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Sal.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I get out of here now.
And I will send a recording of this to everybody who attended, so,
Thank you, Rob.
for 1995.
I don't know how to get out of here.
I'll just end it.
All right, thanks.